Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We are so pleased to have Professor Rebecca Sandefur with us today. I'm going to read her bio to you because first of all, she's incredibly accomplished, but also I think hearing about her background and knowing the experience that she brings will be helpful. So Professor Rebecca Sandefur is Associate Professor of Sociology and Law at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My law school, by the way. She's also faculty fellow at the American Bar Foundation, where she founded and leads the foundation's Access to Justice Research Initiative. In 2013, she was the Hague Visiting Chair in the Rule of Law, affiliated with the Hague Institute for Internationalization of Law. In 2015, she was named Champion of Justice by the National Center for Access to Justice. Professor Sandefur's research focuses on inequality, particularly as it relates to law. Her scholarship includes investigations of work and inequality in the legal profession and other professional occupations, lawyers' pro bono service and its contributions to legal aid, and studies of ordinary people's experiences with common problems that could bring them into contact with the civil justice system. Her current research on the public includes the Community Needs and Services Study, called CNSS, a community-cited, multi-method study of ordinary people's experiences with civil justice problems and the resources available to assist them in handling those problems. The CNSS is funded by the National Science Foundation and the American Bar Foundation. Her current research on lawyers and legal services provision includes the Roles Beyond Lawyers project, a study of emerging models that use trained non-lawyers to provide services traditionally available only from lawyers. The Roles Beyond Lawyers project is conducted in collaboration with Thomas Clark of the National Center for States Courts, funded by the Public Welfare Foundation. Media outlets such as the Washington Post, ABA Journal, and Los Angeles Daily Journal have written about her work. She has made presentations on her research to state access to justice commissions, bar association groups, the National Conference of Bar Examiners, at the Department of Justice, to the White House Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, and to the Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference. And I am so thrilled that she is now here to talk to us. Professor, welcome. Thank you very much for the time that you're taking to be with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Once upon a time, I lived in Sunnyvale, and I was on a committee of the Access to Justice Commission, the Right to Counsel Committee. And even in just the short time that I've been here and listened to you, California has come such a long way away from lawyers for everybody all the time. I mean, I think it's wonderful. I think this is a really big opportunity. So if California does something good, it helps a whole lot of people. But it also is a great model for the rest of the country. So I'm delighted that you're starting to work on this. I'm going to talk about 4 things. I'm just going to give a little reprise of what we know about how people think about their justice problems. I'm going to talk about the potentials for legal technologies to assist them. Those potentials right now are pretty much unrealized. And I'm going to show that by talking about the current landscape of technologies that exist. And then I want to talk about the insights that our research shows about how we could do things differently going forward to make these tools more effective than they are now. So one thing we know from my survey in a middle-sized city in the Midwest, from the LSC's 2017 survey, from subsequent research, is that there are hundreds of millions of civil justice problems that emerge in this country every year. And they affect every group. So in my survey, it was 2/3 of adults. In the Legal Services Corporation survey, it was 78% of adults had at least one problem come up in a year or 18 months. So lots and lots of problems, and they're not equally distributed. So people of color are more likely to encounter these problems. Women are more likely to encounter these problems. And of course, poor people are more likely to encounter these problems. The same collection of problems than people who are not poor. So all groups in society have these issues, but they're not equally distributed. The other thing that we know, and this is not just true in the United States, this is a global fact. The vast majority of justice problems that people have, you will never, ever see. You, as a member of the legal profession, as a judge, will never see these problems. So the legal system, even if we consider it really broadly, so all of the courts, all of the administrative hearing offices, all of the lawyers, they're at the top of a giant iceberg that sees maybe 15, 25% of people's problems, which implies that 85 three-quarters of people's problems are not making it to you, are not making it to any formal legal thing. So you're in a place where it looks like this. The vast majority of people's issues are handled without recourse to the formal law. And once upon a time, we thought that this was because lawyers were incredibly expensive and court fees were too high. And those things may be true, but they're not the reason that people don't use law. And that insight is crucial in thinking about how to design technologies that would assist people. So if you ask people, hey, you've told me that your employer's not paying you overtime. That's called wage theft, but they don't have to recognize that it's called wage theft, right? It's just a fact about their lives. Or you're 2 or more months behind on your rent, which means you're at risk of eviction, but they don't have to know that. It's just a fact about their lives. If you say, okay, let's go through these 95 different specific problems around employment, around housing, around benefits, around your neighbors, around your family. You've told me you had this specific problem, your employer's not paying you overtime. What kind of problem is that? Is it a personal problem? Is it a moral problem? Is it a bureaucratic problem? Is it a criminal problem? Is it a legal problem? Is it bad luck? Is it God's will for you? The most common way that people will describe their justiciable civil legal problems is as bad luck or part of God's plan for them. Now, if I think this is just something that happens to me, or even more, if I think it's supposed to be happening to me, I am not going to go file a lawsuit about it. I am not going to go see an attorney about what to do about this situation. I'm not thinking about this in a legal frame at all. That's a key insight if you're thinking about how to design interventions that will meet people where they are, because that's what these new interventions will have to do. There's another chunk of justice problems that people describe in a way that suggests that they are not interested in third-party intervention into that problem. So these are our problems. They're my family's problems. They're a private problem. They're a community problem. Someone's going to solve this problem, but it's going to be us. It's not going to be third parties who are outside. And then there's a tiny proportion of justiciable events that people actually understand to be legal. So any kind of intervention that we all come up with has to recognize this fact about how people understand their justice problems and recognize the fact that the vast majority of these things are not making it to courts. And by the way, we don't want them to, right? So if you leave out traffic, there are an estimated 25 million civil cases in state courts in this country every year. Okay, there's an estimated 150 million civil justice problems happening every year. There's no way we would want all that stuff to go through courts or any kind of formal legal process. So what are the ways we can assist people with those problems that don't bring them all into court? People don't go to law. They typically try to handle things on their own. They occasionally do nothing. When they reach out to third parties for assistance, the first place they go is their immediate social network. They go to family and friends, and they get their ideas about what to do. There is about a quarter of problems that people take to a third party. That third party is usually not an attorney. So people go to religious leaders. People go to community organizations. People go to membership organizations. People go to elected officials. People go to, if they are in something that provides them an ombudsman, they'll go to that person. They're very creative in how they reach. But a lot of their reaching is not to law. And part of the reason that they're so likely to either rely on themselves or their friends is the way they understand about their problem. So if you say to somebody, okay, you've told me you had this concrete event in your life that is justiciable, but you didn't go to anybody outside your immediate social network for help, why not? What you see is that cost explains less than a fifth of the instances in which people do not seek help. Right? So it may be really expensive, but that's not how people are thinking. Sometimes people don't know what to do. Sometimes they're stressed out. But the most common reasons people give for not seeking help for a justice problem are that they got this one, right? I don't need advice. I understand this situation. I know what to do. There's another version of that that's a little bit more fatalistic. It wouldn't make any difference, which still implies that I understand the situation and I know what to do, and what to do is nothing. And the challenge is that sometimes these people are absolutely right. And we should, acknowledge that. But sometimes they're disastrously wrong. And so finding a way to catch people who are making what we wouldn't want them, a decision we, the people, would not want them to make, is the real challenge in thinking about how to design these kinds of interventions. Okay, so that's the way people think about their justice problems and some of the challenges it presents to us if we want to think about how to help them. Now, there's an enormous amount of hype about how technology can solve every problem that every person has in this society right now. And there are a couple of reasons that you see it in the legal space. So one is, once upon a time, there were all these human beings, we called them lawyers, and they did all this stuff that was called legal work. And particularly if you look in the big law space, Many of them have been replaced by robots, right? So once you have a word processing program that can look for a word in a whole big pile of documents, you don't need 5 associates to look for that word in a whole big pile of documents. So there is some of this stuff that can be automated, and I think there is a certain fear in the bar about being replaced by robots. There's another side to the hype, which has to do with the services people might receive that they're not receiving now if we use technology. And so one approach to that is that, the nice thing about technology, if you're lucky, is that it's very efficiently scalable. So you can provide that same service to lots and lots of people, or that same opportunity to lots and lots of people at a lower price. The other thing that people are excited about legal technologies for is, let's imagine what a legal technology does is it takes part of the expertise or the ability to use the justice system that used to be held only by fully qualified professionals, and it distributes it out. So it gives it to people in communities so that they have that knowledge or that capacity. They're now empowered in a way that they weren't before. So that's another reason that people are excited about the possibilities of these tools. We're not achieving much of this right now. All of you are still human beings. You have not been placed by robots. And most of the tools that exist right now are neither efficiently scalable nor legally empowering. But there's no reason it has to stay that way. One way to think about these tools and what they do is to think about them, as I said just a moment ago, as taking pieces of legal expertise and legal capacity and distributing them. So if you think about what a lawyer can do in our system, a lawyer can represent you. So that lawyer can speak on your behalf and act as you, whether in a formal legal setting or with the other side. That lawyer can enact things on your behalf. He or she can file motions, make statements, do stuff like that. That person can give you legal advice. This turns out to be an important linchpin here, and I'm delighted that you all are thinking about this. So legal advice is the ability, as you all know, to say, okay, from the messy facts of your life, here are the legally actionable issues, and here's what I think you should do about them. Lawyers have privilege, so you all know this too. So information that goes back and forth between lawyers and their clients can stay inside that relationship. It's protected. Anybody in this country can give legal information. That is, they can tell you what the law says. And the other thing about lawyers, at least in our system, is that once you are qualified and you're in the bar, you are omnicompetent. You may not feel omnicompetent, but you can practice in any area of law, in any forum where you're listed on the rolls. Okay, so if that's what a lawyer does, it's a long time before we're going to have robot lawyer. I mean, that is an enormous set of capacities, a tremendous amount of information. We're very, very far from that. But what you do see is different kinds of tools that pull off smaller bits of this, usually in just 1 or 15 areas of law. So the most widespread tool for low-income people in the United States, every state has a statewide legal aid website. And most of them have all kinds of articles that were written in the 80s and 90s by third parties, digitized and put up on the web. And so if you want to know about, I don't know, how to get your security deposit back, you have to read a 25-screen article about landlord-tenant law. That usually is written at a reading level that's too high for most people in this country who have less than a high school degree. You might also be able to fill out a form. Sometimes you have to print the form out and use a pen, but there are some, if states can get it together, and this turns out to be a big issue, if states can get it together to agree that there's one form to do something and it must be accepted by every court, then you can put that form on that website and people can try to execute it themselves. So there are many, many things in this space, in the form space and the information space. What you see much less of are tools that actually would help the vast majority of people who don't know their problem is legal. So look at what that says, Montana Law Help. Okay, so I'm going to go there if I think I have a legal problem or I want a lawyer. But what about the 90-some-odd% of cases where I don't think that's true? So sort of the way this stuff is fronted makes a big difference. So in the middle here is something that, please don't sue these people because I love them. But once I describe what they do, you're going to see they're kind of giving legal advice. Maybe they're not. I don't know. But this is a tool called Just Fix, and this is a woman who's holding up her cell phone, and she has a picture of a dead rat. And what Just Fix does is it says, are there some problems with your apartment that you would like your landlord to just fix? Let's go through a little, very simple interview. Is there mold in the bathroom? Are there rats? Are there cockroaches? Does the elevator work? Did the common spaces leak? Whatever. You go through the whole thing, you press next, and it says, okay, you told me there was mold in the bathroom, go take a picture of it with your cell phone. You told me there were rats, go take a picture of them with your cell phone. Then you press done, and it writes a letter to your landlord that says, dear landlord, I live at this property. I am your tenant. I would like to tell you that under New York City housing codes, you are violating the following things, and you must fix X, Y, Z. You have this many days to do it. You've got to give me 72 hours before you enter into my apartment. And by the way, appendices A through K are the date stamped, time stamped, geolocation stamped photos from my phone of these violations. And then this organization will send that certified letter to your landlord. You don't have to know you have a legal problem. You don't have to know you have any rights. You just have to know that there's some crappy situation that you want fixed. So there are very few things like this. But obviously there's a lot of potential here to work on specific problems in a focused way. So we did by locking undergraduates in a windowless room and making them search Google Play and iTunes, and by looking at venture capital lists and all kinds of things, we tried to identify as many of these tools as we could. And we found 322, and then after I released the report about on them, 8 people wrote me and said, you missed my tool. So there's like 335. And they do a vast number of things. So there are things like LegalZoom, which are both smart document preparation, but also a platform for unbundled legal services. There are, I don't know how these things exist. There are 1 million lawyer referral services. No one uses them. No one used lawyer referral services when they involved the phone. No one uses lawyer referral services when they're on the internet. But I guess it's sort of a cheap, easy thing to set up. So there are many, many of those. Legal Match is one of them. And then there are a range of them that help you work on some kind of specific problem. So Simple Citizen lets you figure out if you are eligible for certain kinds of status regularization under federal immigration law, which makes things much more scalable because it's federal. It helps you do the documents. I think Simple Citizen you pay for. So there are about 30% of these that are either pay for service or freemium, as they call it. There are several that do immigration. There are several for tickets of different kinds. So with Fixed, you take a picture of your ticket, that program works on it, and then you pay them a contingency fee of what you save by getting the ticket adjusted or forgiven. There are a range of them in the criminal space as well, and I put up this one because I like whimsy. This is the Oh Crap app. But it also illustrates the fact that this is an entirely unregulated space, and so who knows whether the Oh Crap app is good for you or not. So the Oh Crap app will text your mom that you've been arrested, connect you with a bail bonds person, connect you with a lawyer, and will sell you arrest insurance. Never heard of it before, but apparently it's a product, and you can buy it from this app. So many different kinds of things happening. Some of them are probably totally credible. Some of them are maybe not credible. There's not really an easy way for consumers to tell the difference between those things right now, which is another thing to think about in this space. The problem with all of these tools is that most of what they offer is not what people want or need. Most of what they offer is what providers already have, right? Which is information, right? So remember, nobody thinks their legal problems are legal, so they're not out there looking for legal help. 91% of justice problems, at least in my survey, people don't recognize legal aspects. There are very few tools that help you identify the fact that you have an actionable problem and take some action on it. Most of them assume that you've already figured out that your thing is legal. So the vast majority of these things provide legal information about your legal problem that you already understand is legal, or they will connect you to lawyers to assist you with your legal problem that you already understand is legal, or they'll help you make a legal document for your legal problem that you already understand is legal. There are a few that will help you sort of compile evidence, but typically it's for something that you realize is a claim, right? Otherwise, why are you doing it? There are very few of them that actually help you diagnose that problem as actionable. Like, I have a problem, I could do something about it. Maybe it's a legal solution, maybe it's not a legal solution. That's where the possibility space is here. That's where the wedge is to get in. There are some other issues with these technologies if you're thinking about them as things that would be used by consumers rather than by intermediaries. So most Americans have access to the internet, although some don't. Some have no private access to the internet. But many people's access to the internet is smartphone dependent, which means there are data issues and cost issues. And the folks who are most likely to be smartphone dependent are the same people we're trying to target with legal aid. So So folks who are low income, folks who have less education. So maybe we're designing tools that are really good for middle class people, but are not maybe matching the needs of the actual population we're trying to help. So besides the technology excluding people at this particular time, these tools are designed in ways that make them less likely to be accessible to a legal aid population. Only about 25% of them present whatever they offer in a language other than English. If it's presented in a language other than English, it's usually Spanish, a place where you'd see a difference. New York, California, you might see 5 languages, 8 languages, because they're more diverse, bigger, wealthier states, but usually it's English or English and Spanish. And then almost all these things are really heavily text-based. And so being very text-based creates barriers for 2 different groups of people. First of all, people who can't see text to read it, but then the 1 in 6 Americans who basically don't have enough literacy to read a newspaper cannot use these tools, and they are going to be disproportionately concentrated in the legal aid population. So a lot of promise here, but not really being realized. The other thing that's really interesting about these tools is even the extremely cool ones, JustFix is an extremely cool tool, adoption rates are really quite low. It's very challenging to get people to use these things as we are currently rolling them out and implementing them. So how could we make this more useful? Well, one of the things that you'll hear more about as you learn from Margaret Hagan and her colleagues at the Design Lab is when the internet started in the 90s, a whole bunch of words, like a wiki, seemed really cool, and it made sense to all of us. But all of that has moved forward, and so consumers' expectations about what a website is going to be like or what a web tool is going to be like have changed. What Margaret Hagan is doing is working with the communities that would use the tools to do user-centered design. Most of these tools were not designed with user-centered design, and so that has got to be part of the next step. The other thing, and this I've found is true, part of this is an age issue, but part of it is not. There are many of these tools where people might use them if you give them a human intermediary. They would leverage the capacities of the human intermediary, but people are not going to use them by themselves because they don't trust them, because they're not comfortable with computers, because they have low literacy levels, whatever. So finding ways to pair them with people will make them more used and useful. There are also kind of financial issues here. So, the reason that statewide legal aid websites are so bad is because they were designed in the 90s and none of those organizations have the money to update them. And you do actually have to keep making sure that these things work, that your links aren't broken, that that as people's expectations change, your product and service change, and that costs money. And the way we fund this stuff right now, we say, that's a great idea, and then we leave them alone. So thinking about a way to make that kind of funding more sustainable, I think, is key. The other thing is that we think all this stuff is going to scale really easily, and sometimes it does. So immigration law is federal. We know there are massive differences in how legal professions in different parts of the country work. There are arbitrary distinctions between judges and the number of things that they approve or don't approve, but at least the law on the books for immigration is the same throughout the country. But there are 3,000 some odd counties. And every one of them may have its own its own housing code or its own whatever. And so scaling from California, from Sacramento to San Francisco for a range of issues is actually not a straightforward thing to do. So thinking about that makes this more expensive and time-consuming and challenging than it sort of seems at first. And then finally, so if you imagine the kinds of things that Margaret's trying to do or what Robot Lawyer would do, so part of that is the interface out being very accessible and engaging, but part of it is that behind that interface, actual human beings and organizations are coordinated in a very sleek way. It turns out it's really hard to get state courts to behave. So in more than one state in this country, when I do this research, they will say, some group will say, we got the state Supreme Court to agree that this is the form to respond to your eviction, or this is the way you change your name, or whatever. And then they'll say, and then we put it in our tool, and then e-filing is its own problem, but we put it in our tool. But when they print it out and take it to the clerk just says, no, I'm sorry, we only use the pink ones with the staples in the middle on the right side. Now, that's a cultural issue about American courts and how state courts and how they work. And so thinking about how to change that, which would have to be done in each specific location, is important, an important opportunity for making these tools much more effective than they are now. Because the person has to be able to execute the thing that you've allowed them to do. And getting the state courts to participate in that is essential. And then finally, and this is why I was so happy to hear the first conversation that you all were having today, right now, the reason most of these tools are terrible is because there are deep concerns in the community of developers that you're going to go after them if they create a tool like JustFix that does something useful, because it's nudging up against the edge of legal advice. And so thinking about either one of two things is happening. Either the way that community understands legal advice is wrong, right? It's more restrictive than it actually is, which is a possibility. Or the other possibility is that it's too restrictive. And so then if the UPL restrictions on legal advice are too tight, what's the smart way? What's the evidence-based, careful, deliberative way to relax those restrictions so that these things can be useful as well as used? Thank you.
Questions,
Yeah.
comments?
Love every bit.
I also want to support something that you're saying about the cultural change of courts and clerks, is that there's also a financial incentive sometimes to, if you have a clerk, for example, who sells forms, they're not very happy if you automate those. And so what we have found sometimes in the state that I work in, where we have created county-specific and county-compliant document assembly tools that are being rejected by the clerk because the clerk doesn't want to recognize, the clerk sells those forms and can tell that it's not coming from them. And so even though we are compliant with the statutory and regulatory language, that it have the staple on the left-hand side and that it, it do all the things that the thing is supposed to do, they figured out that it's being done by somebody else. And what they really want is for everybody to come in and pay $25 for their form packets. And so, I mean, it's more than just culture. There's also financial disincentives for this stuff to be allowed to work.
Andrew?
I also think one of the things that were identified that was particularly helpful was the gap between people's understanding if their problem is legal or not, and how we would go about kind of letting them know that there is something available. And one of the challenges, this is more of a comment than a question, is I do find, at least myself, growing up in a community that also was low economic kind of background, et cetera, a lot of the time what scares people away from going to lawyers is their perceived cost of the services, and therefore it's almost like we have a chicken and an egg problem with that particular issue. And I don't have any kind of proposals on how to solve it, but just something that I think as a task force we do need to be very mindful of is how do we even get folks to be willing to kind of engage with the legal system to begin with. And it was something that I think was very important to bring up.
Lori?
I wanted to ask you a question because what I found most surprising in your report was the idea that people don't know they have a legal problem. So it's actually not the cost that's the majority of the issue, but that people don't identify their problems as legal. Do you have a thought on what one thing we could do in legal to help people identify their problems as legal more, or get the help they need? That's my first question. And my second question is, do you think that legal needs to be the one driving that? If people don't know their legal problems, who's best situated to help them maneuver those problems?
So one thing that we know about the way adults think and learn is that we're all adults here, right? We're really bad at taking abstract information we learned 25 years ago and applying it to a concrete situation that we're in. So the kinds of educational or informational interventions that work are those that catch you when you realize you have a situation and are targeted to your situation. There aren't, I mean, it's one of the ways that different programs try to do that now is by embedding the legal service in some other place where people already go. So you probably heard about medical legal partnerships. This is when you have a community health clinic or a hospital, and they'll partner with a legal aid lawyer or a law school clinic, and the idea is sometimes there are health problems that have a legal dimension. The marquee example would be asthma. So lots of kids who live in urban environments have frequent asthma attacks, and one of the things that creates those asthma attacks is cockroach feces. Well, that's a violation of a housing code. It's a pest infestation. And so if the lawyer can get the landlord to stop that, you can actually improve the child's health, like their experience of daily life. So there are some that try to place them in churches and other kinds of religious organizations. There are some that try to put it in schools, but that's one. So co-location is one way to do it. Another thing that I haven't seen anyone try yet, but I wonder if it would work, is let's say for the next 7 years, the state of California said, we're going to have a legal education campaign that's going to go like this. What are the problems that we're worried about that people have that they could take action on? So when I think about this moment in history, wage theft, right? Because we want people to get paid what they're owed. There are lots and lots of kids in this country whose parents, for a range of reasons, cannot take care of them, and there are often other people who can, but those other people don't understand. You can't just take your grandchild home and then drop her off at school, right? You have to have some kinds of legal documents that let you get her health care and enroll her and get her vaccinated and all those kinds of things. So could you imagine every year, 18 months, there's a campaign about a specific issue, wage theft, guardianship, whatever it might be. And so then that's going to catch the people who are having that experience right now. So that's some chunk of people who will now be sensitized to a legal issue. But, maybe it's not happening to me right now, but 2 years from now when it happens to me, my cousin's like, I saw this commercial that said. I think I'll give an anecdote about why that this can work. So I was doing focus groups before I did that survey to sort of try to figure out how people think about their justice problems. And I had them look at hypothetical scenarios, like Mary's 2 months behind on her rent. What should she do? People are totally unaware of what they could do. But more than once, someone would say, I don't know what she should do about age discrimination, wage theft, this potential eviction. But if she had been injured in an accident, she could call and they would give you the name of the law firm that was on TV all the time. And so I think that the genius of that is it tells you have a problem, it tells you can act on that problem, and it tells you where to go to act. So some kinds of very focused, targeted programs like that, which could be on TV, they could be community embedded, whatever, I think would go a long way in sensitizing people to their rights, essentially.
Mm-hmm. So follow-up question. Then I think of personal injury as well, how well that they reach the consumer. But there is money in personal injury. We all of those that support law really like to get hired by personal injury attorneys because they have money and they spend money, unlike some of our other lawyer friends. So that then raises the question, I am a fan of, I love to follow the rules. Although on this committee, I am the one proposing we break and do away with all the rules. Because the reality is there isn't money in the legal field to do all of this as it stands today. So how do we find that money? What are your suggestions? Because I love the idea of commingling relationships. We have a great partnership in Tennessee with our Access to Justice groups and very faith-based partnerships where we are doing legal clinics in churches. But I'd love to see us take it to a next level. What if those churches were then empowered to provide legal forms and legal advice in very specific areas? Because that's where people go and look for help in Tennessee. That's our entire social network. So my question is to you, how do we get the funding? Where do we get that from? Is that in legal? What's our next step?
I think besides doing all the usual things, right? Foundations, government, blah, blah, blah. I think there are two things I would love to see the access to justice space in America explore. One of them is, can some of the people who receive this stuff pay something for it and thereby subsidize the people who cannot afford to pay anything for it? There are a lot of people at 126% of poverty, or if you're in a place that's really generous, 201% of poverty, who can't access the free service, but could pay a little bit for the not free service. And that lets you cross-subsidize. I think another thing to think about is big law donates an enormous amount of time in the form of pro bono hours because it's in that ranking. And it lets them tell their associates a story about how they're not just helping rich people stay rich, right? They're doing something, they're being real lawyers. What if, instead of just donating that time, they did what legal aid has wanted them to do forever, which is just give us the money, right? Like, so give us the value of that time, the market value of that associate's time, that bank of associates' time. And that would fund a lot of these things. That would be a massive amount of money. So then you have to think about how do you create the incentive structure so that they have some reason to do that. Is the tax write-off good enough? I don't even know if you can write that off your taxes anymore. Probably, given the recent tax reform. But would you have to work with U.S. News to change the way they calculate the social benefit issue, or would you have to create a new index that's rewards them for doing that? I don't know, but they would need some kind of incentive to change that behavior. But if they did, that's a lot of money.
Question. One of your slides where you showed that there's sort of a disproportionate impact, that the need for civil legal services is great, but it's disproportionately impacting certain communities. I thought that on your income chart, there were still like over 50% of middle income and high income folks with unmet civil legal service needs, or with civil legal service
They just have problems. We don't know whether they need legal services or not, but we know they have problems.
They have problems. So one of the things that I keep wondering about as I learn more about the issues we're sitting here is how far up the income ladder the justice gap actually goes, meaning that gap between the problem or the need and your ability to actually hire a lawyer to provide the service. And therefore, is there a whole population now that's not getting any service at all that could pay for it? Not just the folks at 126% or 201%, but the folks at 300% and 400%, because an actual traditional lawyer at an hourly rate is very, very expensive for many people. So is there a market there that could essentially fund or subsidize services that would be provided to the truly low income? That's what I think there is a business model here. There's money to be made, and so I just keep wondering about that.
I think you're absolutely right. And as an observer of the American legal profession, I'm always baffled at the lack of entrepreneurship in the personal client bar. Right, so unbundling is a possibility in every state in this country now, but very few lawyers do it. But unbundling is exactly what makes legal services affordable and sensible to a middle-income person. Right, I'm going to do this for you, this for you, this for you, and it's going to cost this much. Why not? I mean, I don't know why there are very few lawyers operating on that business model, but there are. I mean, when I ask them, they say, "Well, I'll go in and the judge will make me, represent this, and I'll lose I'll lose a bunch of money by doing this unbundled thing." But I don't know that there's any empirical evidence that happens a lot.
I just wanted to throw out, there is a survey that I was provided with early on in my entrepreneurship of starting a company. So I went from working in law firms to starting a business that supports lawyers. And I had a lawyer turned real entrepreneur, which I think, meaning he's went into some crazy places, provide me a survey that was the most informative for me in creating my business. And I think I'm going to share that with the group. But I think there's an answer to that idea of why lawyers don't do it. One of the study identified 6 places where lawyers are abnormally different than the average person. And it's just fun reading, so I'm going to share it. But one of the places is, so autonomy is a big one, very high autonomy, which means not working with groups. So why haven't we created, better relationships? As a profession, lawyers are actually much more autonomous and don't collaborate well. But it's the risk adverse. If you are risk adverse, and we actually were talking about this earlier, as an entrepreneur who works for lawyers, I joke all the time, I'm the least scared of getting sued. I should be terrified of that. I have zero concerns. Not zero, but very few. and that lets me do things and push boundaries that most of the lawyers I work with would never consider because they are risk adverse as a personality. And so I'd like to encourage our group to maybe think about, as we are creating our suggestions, remembering the group that we're dealing with. If we continue to allow lawyers to be the one pushing the innovation, we are actually asking a group of people who, by personality, are abnormally adverse to risk, which is the opposite of what you need to be an entrepreneur or to push innovation. And so I think there is an answer to that.
Here.
I'm wondering, given our position in California and our location close to Google and Facebook and those platforms, if we should be working with them when somebody types in a Google search asking about their problem, rather than have a law firm's article come up, have an app that we agree would be helpful to someone with that problem come up on the search engine. Same with Facebook, as we know, you'll type anything to anybody out there, and all of a sudden the advertisements coming up are related to whatever it was you were looking at. If there was a way to work with them to help in this area to kind of bring the ideas to the people that are having the issues, we're in a great location to be looking at that.
And Margaret Hagan actually is one of the bazillion things she's doing is a project called Learned Hands. It's a little joke. And so what Learned Hands does is it takes the queries that people write on Reddit about justice problems, and then it crowdsources issue spotting from lawyers and law students. And then that would then be the data that would train AI to do exactly the kind of query sorting that you're describing. I mean, it started 2 weeks ago, right? A month and a half ago, and so it's very early days. But I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of potential there.
Bridget?
I wanted to ask you about whether you have seen lawyers collaborating with other professions. So when you were talking about the child with asthma or people recognizing that they need guardianship documents, I could envision working with physicians to train them, if they see these particular symptoms, to ask families about these issues, or same with social workers, for example, with the guardianship. So I was just wondering if you've seen any models of multidisciplinary focus on these issues.
Besides the medical legal partnerships, which are kind of the big one, there are 300 some odd of them around the country. There are a few social worker programs. There's also, I think it's here in San Francisco and Denver and a few other places, social workers in libraries. So many people who don't have homes spend time and take care of basic life functions in libraries. And that becomes an issue for the libraries and the other patrons. And so now there are social workers in a range of cities who do outreach to those folks to help them connect to various kinds of benefits and services that they can't connect to. And a lot of those are basically justice problems. Like if I'm a veteran and I can't get my benefits application through, it's that. So I think there's a lot of potential there. The thing is to think about where people already go.
Simon and Andrew.
Just a quick comment. In terms of it wouldn't be feasible necessarily to have that occur via kind of the Google example. The challenge that we have is that it would actually take quite a lot of money from a kind of SEO word ranking to do that. So I think the way that we may want to think about things is not necessarily that the state bar pushes the tools, but creates an environment where the economics and the benefits that may accrue to companies that are building these tools, that we make access to justice make business sense. And I think we all seem to agree that there is something there, but I think that that's the framework we should be thinking in, because it won't be possible for us to compete to kind of push that as a group or as a task force.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. One thing I'm curious if you could comment on, whether through the research or through your own shared experiences, is mobile versus desktop. And when we talk about access to justice or thinking about technology, oftentimes we assume everyone has a laptop or people have an iPad, right? But oftentimes someone has to go to a public library. But in the same vein, there's over 240 million smartphones in the United States alone. Of course, there's a gap within that as well. People who can afford to have a smartphone, those who can't. And particularly among generation lines, my iPhone is my remote control for my life. And oftentimes I expect every single website I visit to have some sort of mobile-friendly option. But just getting a court to agree to create a website is a victory in itself. And to have it mobile-friendly is even a larger victory oftentimes. So I'm just curious if you will see some of that coming and maybe just look into the future and share with us the importance of making sure that we don't just offer technology, but we offer technology that actually meets customers and consumers at their convenience.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think if courts are staid and conservative institutions, and as you say, even letting them have a website where you can get the change of name form or whatever is a big deal. I think what may push courts to be a little bit more mobile friendly, and if they were here, there must be some here, they would complain about how it's expensive. Then that's you have to find the funding for that. But many courts are excited about the idea of taking some disputes entirely online. And in order to do that and make it effective, whatever interface people have is going to have to be mobile friendly, because you can't expect everyone to go to the library and participate in their debt collection lawsuit asynchronously on 15 different occasions. I mean, it sort of obviates all the good that the consumer would get from that. So that, I think, is probably, that shift may push courts a little bit.
I just had a I hope to be a quick question. Your last point in your last slide has been sticking with me, and it said the restrictions on legal advice by non-lawyers means tools can't do much without running into the unauthorized practice of law. And then you pose the question to us, which is to look at whether the UPL restrictions are too tight, and I would assume you would think that they are. And I was just curious, and then you also asked us, what careful, deliberative way to relax those restrictions might we consider to allow these tools to be used. I was just curious if you had given thought to what restrictions, what relaxation of restrictions might be envisioned, and what guidance you might give to our group as we consider that very difficult issue.
So, from my perspective, the only reason to have restrictions on the unauthorized practice of law is consumer protection. But it's not my monopoly, right? So, but if the issue is consumer protection, then what matters is creating an environment where people can tell that there are bad lawyers, there are bad providers of every kind, but where people have some ability to tell the difference between credible and not credible sources of support. So in the United Kingdom, the way they do this is there are no restrictions on giving legal advice. Anyone can give legal advice. But at the same time, there are established advice providers that are signposted as trustworthy, like the Citizens Advice Bureau, and all kinds of different sort of group and issue-focused organizations that you can go to for help with your housing problem, with issues around aging, with issues around being a child, whatever. So I would be fine with getting rid of all the restrictions on advice. If there were something done to create an ecology where there's some kind of signposting to consumers about which of this advice I could believe and which I couldn't believe. I don't think, the space of tools is a little bit concerning right now, because let's say I'm a low-income person who gets arrested and I go to the Oh Crap app and I buy arrest insurance. I can't imagine that arrest insurance is a good product, but maybe it is. So now I've lost money to pay for the insurance, and then it may cause me other problems that I have to then do further work to solve. What's a way to, I don't think we want to regulate that space, but what's a way to market, quality check it or something? I don't think that the bar can do all of this. I think that it's, to go back to the point about connection, there need to be collaborations across lines of activity that would help you all. The restrictions on UPL are there for some good reasons. Would help you all work with other entities to retain those good reasons, which are, as I say, I think about consumer protection, but then some of this is just excessive.
If I may, you're all going to get an email later today. I actually sent it to Lauren. I think she's sending it to you now. The good news is we've solved all these problems.
The marketing platform is called Master Blaster. I developed it 2 years ago. It does exactly what you're looking for. The website platform that you're looking for is called Quantum Website, and we actually function in 58,000 jurisdictions across the country. And on the first article I sent, I think I actually used your same image of the iceberg. So I absolutely love that. We've had a lot of success down in LA working with local organizations and trying to take them to scale by giving them a cloud-based platform. And in this type of scenario, if the court's involved and can actually sort of ratify the workflow and then distribute that throughout the entire state, available to be branded by each individual organization that needs it, whether it's a jurisdiction or a court or whatever the case may be, it creates some solidity to the flow. It actually removes the need for a sandbox because it can be adjusted as the progress is made, and it communicates outwardly to the community when something comes about. Matter of fact, after the last meeting, a couple of us had a conversation about solving the notorious challenge. And one of the things that I proposed was actually for the bar is that you can actually use an urban legend to shut down certain criminal behaviors, similar to the way in 1985 Washington, D.C. Offered football tickets and then rounded up 100 outstanding felon warrants. And now nobody's going to respond to that letter because they're anticipating the arrests at the other end. And that type of thing could be very, very useful, and that type of marketing can be useful. But it actually, in both cases, is able to actually feed Google the information they need, and then it adds in manipulated metadata to identify a particular article or marketing campaign to an individual location. So we add all the physical locations from neighborhoods up throughout the state of California, and that article will be repeated for each individual location throughout the state. And I've got pitch decks that are part of this email as a link for everybody to go ahead and take a look at those as well. I didn't want to do a full-fledged presentation, but I agree with everything you're saying, and we've got the tools, and they're ready to launch, and thank you for validating all this. The numbers were great. Appreciate it.
I never go anywhere where someone says we've solved all these problems. It's awesome.
Toby.
You were talking about the medical legal partnerships, and I've been involved with one of those, and it really works well. The doctors are advised and trained on how to identify health issues that might have a legal consequence or a legal causation, referred to the lawyer. And we've done the same thing with social workers, with the welfare department, and trained them to find the right people. The biggest problem comes in that because of the rules, the doctor wants feedback. And it's once the client talks to you, it's confidential information. And there's issues about how do we work together as opposed to, and sometimes it's not that they need the feedback because it'll help the client with the legal problem, so it doesn't fit under the exception to attorney-client privilege. It's just that they want to know and get feedback on how they can do better and all those kind of things. And there become problems in providing that kind of input.
Anybody else? Randy.
Professor, it did strike me that there are a number of tools that are already out there, and some actually might be effective, like the Fix-It, but there was such a strong amount of low adoption, I guess, by consumers. Would any sort of state bar or regulator imprimatur help with the outreach to get adoption of these tools? So if there was a state bar approved app, or if there was a provider that was state bar certified, do you think that would make a difference at all?
I think it would make a difference with the intermediaries, right? So the community organizations or whoever that might be the real way that you roll these things out, unless you have a massive advertising budget, which, I suppose we could imagine a world where that's true, but I do think, especially in a space where it's the Wild West, and some of this is real credible activity and some of it's not, to have an official entity that knows, say, we trust this one, You don't have to say anything about the ones you don't trust. I think that'd be very valuable for consumers.
The other thing I noted was that the sustainability of innovation requires capital. Do you think, as a essential proposition, that there has to be some element of non-lawyer ownership or shared equity among entrepreneurs and lawyers in order for the legal tech space to really thrive and continue?
So your former California resident, Jillian Hadfield, would say yes. I think that's not essential, but it also won't work unless there's also a space that's a for-profit space, right? I mean, non-lawyer entrepreneurs are not going to invest in a free service. So then there has to be a way to think about, can we have services where people who cannot afford to pay are subsidized by people who can pay? And then I think it doesn't matter. I'm untroubled by non-lawyer ownership. I think it's an empirical question whether it expands the capacity of these organizations or makes them more creative. So when the UK moved to non-lawyer ownership in 2008, do I have that right? I'm looking at you because I feel like you would know. I think it was 2008 with the LASPO law. They then set up a little office that was sort of trying to study the effect of that on access to justice. And so far, the jury is still out on whether it makes services cheaper or more accessible or whatever. I mean, it may just take a while.
One last question. There's a lot of literature about how legal tech has all this promise, but it's also not the silver bullet. Is it your opinion that there has to be some other innovation in delivering legal services other than tech in order to meet the access crisis? You have the limited legal technicians and all those other things that are happening.
I would say if you were going to put three things together, they would be technology, which needs to be empowered to let people do things that are actually useful. They would be different kinds of service providers who do some of what a lawyer does, but not all. And they're going to need to be able to charge for their services, which is where if they're not charging, no one cares, right? And then the third thing is, and this is problem by problem, there are areas where access to justice is caused by the failure of justice institutions to apply rules they already have. So an example would be consumer debt collection. Many lawsuits in many states have been filed without adequate documentation to show that that respondent owes that money. When courts impose a rule that says not even you have to show us the documentation, but you have to attest under penalty of bad things that you have the documentation, the filings drop dramatically. Now, are there other areas where we can just take the rules we already have and apply them so that people aren't put in the position of having fake justice problems, in a sense? So I think those three things would be the big innovations.
I have a question. I'm not sure, Professor, how much longer you're going to be with us today, and so I want to sort of incorporate you a little bit into what would be the next topic of discussion. We're going to be engaging in a survey to the broad population. So we want tech companies to respond to the survey, and we want individuals in rural communities to respond to the survey. And as a matter of fact, the current thinking is that we would be oversampling rural communities and oversampling people at 125% of poverty or less. So now you know more about the survey than everybody else in the room. Because we want to make sure that we are not just sitting in a room in an ivory tower coming up with recommendations to improve access that nobody's going to take advantage of, right? Like you said, we've got all these tools out there that people aren't taking advantage of. Though I have to say, looking at your list, I am a little baffled by Knife Rights Legal that compiles the knife laws of all 50 states, but that's just me. So if you were drafting this survey to figure out what we could do in the digital world, in the technology world to improve access, what are the key things that you would say we should be asking to the rural communities, the low-income populations, and to the tech companies to make sure that we're putting something together that makes sense?
That's a great question. I think when you do this survey, you probably have a couple of goals. So one is to understand stuff. and the other is to tell a story about California that's legible to the people who you need to move. And so you're probably going to end up asking a lot of questions we already know the answer to, right? Which is fine. I mean, that's what you have to do in a place where politics are very local. I mean, you're going to find that a lot of people have problems, that very few of them go to law, that they happen in core areas of life around housing, taking care of your family, livelihood, whether that's your pension or your benefits or your wages. You're going to find that if you ask people how they think about their problems, you're going to find that they don't think about them in legal terms, because we find that everywhere, all around the world, when we do these surveys. You're also going to find probably that the people who have most access to law are wealthy people and poor people. And then there's sometimes they call it a sandwich group that's in the middle. But then thinking about what it would be cool to know that would help you design a better world, I think you want to know in some kind of detail where people go when they're having different, either where they go just socially or where they go when they're in trouble. I think from the tech companies, I'm not sure a survey is a way to get at this, but what would make this an attractive value proposition for them to enter into this space? And provide a service that on a unit basis is not going to be very profitable, but if you did it at scale, you could make a living doing it. I think for people in rural areas, one thing that I discovered, so the second part of this tech project is doing case studies of JustFix, of statewide legal aid websites, of Citizenship Works, and of a tool called Risk Detector that helps a social worker identify whether an old person is at risk of exploitation or abuse, and then ships a score off to a lawyer. So if it's over a certain point, the lawyer will come back and investigate. One of the things that's really clear in looking at these things in rural areas is, part of it is that rural areas tend to have older people in them, and older people are not so embracing of technology necessarily. But also there are trust issues. And so people who live in small communities are not necessarily interested in the thing that comes from outside and tells them that it's helpful. So thinking about that's why it's important to know where people already go. But are there other ways you can ask them questions that would give you information about how you could get to them, or what they would trust? Like, would they care if the state bar gave this a quality check or something like that? I think that could be useful in designing the outreach for these services in different places, because it'll have to be different in different places.
Lori.
Did you find any data, and this is part of a survey sort of question and comment too, in your work, did you find any data, or has anyone really asked the question of how consumers want to solve their problems? Do they want tools that empower them to do things without lawyers in most cases, or with intermediaries? Because I love the question of where do they go now. I think that's really important. I would love to see us ask that, but I'm not sure I found anything in my various exploration on how people want to solve their own problems. I get a lot of choices on how to solve my medical problems, and some of those are not the best choices, but they're my choices to make. And in legal, I often feel that what we say is lawyers are your best and only option. And so I'm curious of whether you've come across any data, or if you've asked those questions, how do people want to solve these problems?
So I haven't seen a survey that asks them that directly, but I would make two observations from the way they behave. So when Tom Clark and I did our study of limited license legal technicians, people, first of all, don't understand the difference between that and a lawyer, which is totally baffling to someone who's not inside that industry, but they're very happy to have that limited service. As long as someone explains to them, I can't go to court with you, I'm going to do this part, you're going to do this part, it's going to be fine. The clients that we talked to were actually quite content with that. The thing, though, that really blew my mind when I looked at it was, so until the 2008 legal aid reforms in the United Kingdom, 60% of the population was eligible for some kind of subsidized legal service from the private bar, an adjudicare system that's just like Medicare. So you take your government money and you give it to the private bar and you get legal services for that. But then they also have these enormous advice service sector, because anybody can give legal advice. And then they have a system of ombudsmen for every regulated industry and lots of relationships with the government. And so if you have a fight with your cell phone provider here, if you're lucky, you get involved in a class action lawsuit and you get that check for 25 cents 15 years later. But there, you file a complaint with the ombudsman's office. The ombudsman investigates and then makes a binding decision. Either you have to pay or you don't have to pay, and it's done. In that context, even when law is free, people are much more likely to go to an advice service or an ombudsman. I think because they like to keep control of their problems. I don't know whether they feel empowered. I think that's a different question. But it's sort of, they feel like that's a reaction proportionate to the situation. They're getting information about what to do, and they usually can do it. So I think there's a lot of scope, at least behaviorally. People would like a lot more control.
Joyce.
A lot of states are doing the whole triage sort of portal idea that is meant to address, you speak in your slides about the need to diagnose something as having a legal solution. Do you have any, it's very preliminary, and I know not a lot of them, I mean, there are a number that have been launched around the country, but I don't know. Well, so I guess there's two questions. One, do you have any comments on whether or not you think that's going to be a way to address some of that, how to get people to identify their problem as having a legal solution? And number two, are you planning on doing any research that those of us who are following that path could subsequently take advantage of a year or two down the road?
I mean, I think there are two key things for those things to work. And again, they're not going to work for everybody, because not everybody's going to go on the internet. Like, if my employer doesn't pay me overtime, what do I think? I think my employer is a jerk. I'm not going to search my employer is a jerk on Google for how to deal with that problem, right? So that's always going to be true. This is just a slice of the pie that this would help. There are two things that are essential. So one is some kind of natural language processing frontline, like what a human would do, only done by a computer, because people don't think about these things in that way. And the other thing is those portals are only as effective as the networks of actual organizations and human beings that integrate behind them. Yeah. And going back to the autonomy point, that is really, really challenging to do just in the legal aid space. But then once you start going across lines, I mean, it's just like, there's no point in triaging you if I can't send you somewhere.
Right.
And if there isn't real-time information about whether wherever I might send you has capacity, because otherwise it's just like what we do now, only not on paper. Here's a list of 25 places, none of which will be able to serve you. Yeah. Good luck. And so I think that human coordination problem is a much bigger issue than the technical stuff, which Margaret et al. Will work out pretty quickly. Mm-hmm.
So, Donna, you did a good job of moving